Hello everyone and welcome to the Reform Luncheon Series. We have with us today Dr. Kenneth Bedell, who's a Senior Advisor in the Faith-Based and Neighbourhood Partnership Centre at the Department of Education, and he'll be talking about the topic supporting and encouraging communities to become involved in school reform. Ken, we leave it to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, this is a real opportunity and excited to be here to talk about this, and I'm going to just kind of lay out a few ideas and then we can have some discussion and talk about education and particularly how communities can become involved in education. I thought that maybe what I'd start with is to think about the President's comment that he made in the State of the Union, where he lifted up education and pointed out that it is the responsibility of the community and the family and as well as the schools to take part in the education of our children, and that also then. Later in the State of the Union, when the President talked about how great it would be if we took science fairs as seriously as we take something like the Super Bowl. Well, that may sort of sound like the sound bites that are really great to have at a State of the Union address. But what I'd like to argue for the next couple of minutes is that they're not just sound bites or something that we might think, oh, this is obviously a bipartisan issue, who's going to be against educating our children? But that the approach that the President is taking to education is actually grounded on some real fundamental beliefs and some fundamental values that both the President and Secretary Arne Duncan have as they're presenting what ultimately becomes budgets and proposals for educational reform. I'd like to lift up two philosophical underpinnings of the President's and the Secretary's approach to education. The first one is the idea that every child can learn. Now, that may not sound as if that's a particularly radical proposition, but one of the ways that we've evolved our American education system is with a system that's called tracking. And so children are put into certain tracks, and sadly, some children are put into a track that doesn't take them towards being college or career ready, that is not the track that offers them high quality college preparatory courses, or even in some cases advanced placement courses aren't even available to them. There's two ways that tracking is happening. One is within a school, that there's certain children that said, oh, you're not going to make it, and other children then who are put into college preparatory classes. The other way that tracking happens is really across schools, that there'll be a whole school that doesn't offer advanced placement courses, doesn't offer courses that really prepare students for college or even for career. That in the President's book, The Audacity of Hope, he tells a story about going to a school in Chicago, and as he's at that school, one of the teachers says to him, well, there is the those kids syndrome. And he asks about, well, the those kids syndrome, says, yeah, the attitude that, well, those kids aren't going to make it, or those kids are going to have a hard time getting ready for college, or those kids will never go to college. And she said, it isn't those kids, it's our kids. And the President in The Audacity of Hope explains how for him that was a moment of really realizing that the point is that that every child can learn that all children are our children, and that all children are part of what need to be taken seriously in terms of our public education system. Arnie Duncan often tells the story of his mother, who about the time of his birth was asked to teach a Sunday school class. And there were 8 girls sitting around in a circle, and they only had one Bible. Said, okay, well, we'll pass the Bible around. You can each read this Bible. And much to her horror, they couldn't read. And this, for her, was a moment where his mother said, well, I'm gonna get involved. And she started an after-school tutoring program, which Arnie Duncan spent his years growing up then, going to this after-school program with his mother. And these were his friends, his playmates, and then his friends, and then as they grew up and went to college and became professionals, continued to be his friends. And Arnie Duncan says, he doesn't use the president's language of those kids, but the point is that every kid can learn, and that needs to be fundamental in the way that we look at schools and at our education system. This is my own story. I graduated from college and moved to New York City and was trying to go to graduate school, and I found out that if you had a college degree at that point, this was actually 1970, that in 1970 New York City would give you a emergency teaching certificate. And so I went down one day, and that afternoon, because I had a college degree, I had an emergency certificate. And because I had a degree in chemistry, I had an emergency certificate to teach chemistry. But what I did was went out to a school in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Coleman Intermediate School, and became what was called a permanent substitute. I was there on Monday and Fridays when they just knew teachers didn't show up, and they needed a certain number of extra teachers because that's what was happening. The school where several of the kids one afternoon, I was with them and I was talking to them about the study of science and the Bronx School of Science, and they just said to me, no one from this school has ever gone to the Bronx School of Science. And yet my experience was that they were ready, capable, able to learn, and yet that particular school was, today, what Arnie Duncan would call a dropout factory, preparing students to go to high school where they weren't prepared to actually do school. But my experience was that they were bright, eager, and it was a matter of what the school was doing, that they weren't learning. This fundamental that all kids can learn is one of the philosophical basis of what the administration is doing in education. It's saying we need to build up those schools that aren't doing this. To start, Arnie Duncan talks about is building from the bottom, to make sure that every school takes seriously that there are courses to prepare students, and so that they're actually learning, and at the end of high school or college or career ready. The second one that I want to just talk about briefly, that's a philosophical underpinning of what the president's talking about when he talks about his education in the State of the Union, is a complete education. And I brought with me the exact wording that's in the blueprint for reform of education. I just want to read this so you get the words exactly what the blueprint says. It says, students need a well-rounded education to contribute as citizens in our democracy and to thrive in a global economy, from literacy to mathematics, science and technology, to history, civics, foreign languages, and the arts. financial literacy, and other subjects. That it's a fundamental of the understanding of the reform that the President and Arne Duncan want to bring, that a complete education is essential, that it isn't just learning how to read and write, but learning across the board, including, and here I want to reference again President Obama's book, The Audacity of Hope, where he talks about his own religious education and uses that as an example of what's essential in a complete education, that religious education is part of what needs to be included in a complete education. Well, those two pillars, that every child can learn and that we need to have a complete education, are two of the foundations that then the policy, the education policy, gets built on, that ultimately results in programs that are designed to make a difference in education. At the federal level, there's only about 10% of the federal budget, 10% of the total education budget that is paid for by the federal government. So for every $10 that's spent on the education of children in America, $1 of that comes from the federal government. And what Arne Duncan and the President have said, well, we need to use that strategically. We need to be clear that we're working on really making a difference in what happens in the schools that are currently failing our kids. And we need to make sure that we're supporting innovation, and where there are good things that are happening, and we need to focus the federal approach on beginning with those fundamentals and then making a difference where the federal government can make a difference. Before we start kind of a conversation, I'd like to jump from those fundamentals to, well, what does it mean for people in this room, for anyone in America, to participate in this education agenda that the President has? And just to point to a few of those. At one end, there's the starting of schools, or having a public charter school, or actually opening a school to say, we're going to take seriously education and the education of children by providing that. But there's also a very important place in supporting those, and particularly in the schools that are having the most difficult time of providing after school and summer programs, where faith-based groups and other community-based organizations can partner with each other and with the school to make sure that there are additional support for children that are in school. But probably an even more important thing that faith-based and particular groups can do is to enter into the discussion about what's happening in schools, to bring values and dialogue to that discussion, to participate at the level of a school board, or even in a classroom, of sharing of what it really means when we take this seriously, when the community is helping, not just to critique, but to participate in the determination of how it is that we move forward to make sure that every child who can learn does learn, and to make sure that what they learn is a full and broad curriculum, not just that they're learning how to read and to write. I think that's maybe a place to stop, and we can enter into discussion.
If I may, what do you see as the major hindrances and challenges in school reform in the coming 5 to 10 years?
I think the biggest challenge is one of us deciding as a nation that we are going to make a difference. And then it becomes hearing the challenge that the president made in the State of the Union, that this is core and central, and putting resources across the board. Just yesterday, and I think today, the Secretary of Education is in Denver in conversation with school administrators and teachers unions, saying, look, we all want to accomplish the same thing, putting kids first. Let's figure out how it doesn't look as if we have school administrators and teachers that are battling it out for resources. The point is, how do we take the resources we have and make sure that the kids benefit the most? And I think the same goes for the commitment of community groups, the government stepping up now. What's its commitment to education? That will there be a commitment from mosques and synagogues and churches to and the same as the president said in the State of the Union, the role of parents is essential, the first teachers, and our parents going to step up. So it's really a matter of will at this point.
And what do you say? You mentioned parents. What are the best ways that your average mums and dads can play a part? How do you see that taking part? How can the average family play a part in school reform?
It's. I think of my own experience. I grew up in Iowa, and my father was a scoutmaster, and we met in a church basement that actually sponsored. So after school, there was this enrichment activity that my parents were involved in. I was actually slow to learn to read, and when I was in second and third grade, my parents spent time with me in my lessons and helping me to get to learn how to read, to come up to grade level. So that there's also the spending time with kids. And then there's the involvement with the institution itself, parent involvement in the institution, and that parents, whether it's involvement with the PTA or running for the school board to be active there. That I don't know what activity besides providing food and shelter that's a more important part of parenting than taking seriously the education of the children.
Thank you. If I may take questions from the audience, please state your name and affiliation, and there'll be a microphone.
Good afternoon. My name is Robert Randall, and I am president of the District of Columbia Federation of Civic Associations here in Washington.
Great.
The issue of public education reform has been front and center in Washington, and there's been a great deal of debate on the proper direction of reform, and a lot of community activists who want to be and try to be engaged in the reform of education here in the city feel they've been locked out of the process, and that the definition of community engagement is come to a basketball game and blow up balloons and pass out basketballs, rather than to be engaged in the plans for how on education policy, particularly when it comes to trying to restructure a system that everyone agrees needs assistance to go forward. And it seemed as if the previous chancellor made a great effort to block communities from being part of that process, to the point even stated that community engagement was not what it was cracked up to be. So how do people stay engaged when you have supposed heroes in the, I'll be stating point blank that the community is not welcome in the reform process, as if to say that they're not concerned about their children.
Yeah. I don't know that there's any more important question than that one, and hopefully we're going to see some changes in that in DC, just like hopefully there's going to be changes across the country, where DC is not the only city where we've heard as we've gone across the country that here's to say, well, it's tough for us to get connected with the school. We're working hard in our office at the Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnership Center to, from the inside, making sure that we pay attention to when there are grants that are going out, that the wording of what that proposal is includes the involvement of community groups, that when there are anything that comes, we're paying attention there to say, now, I think it takes work at every single one of the levels, that the federal level needs to incentivize community involvement in the work that comes from the federal government. At the local level, I don't deny that it takes hard work and persistence to get the attention of the school officials and to open that up, even the people who, like yourself, who are not only committed to that but experienced with that.
If I can follow
yeah,
up,
do.
In many instances, how the department defines community is an issue. Community organization is an issue. Those of us at the community level define community as grassroots, the ones that stay behind when these national organizations and their affiliates go home after 5 o'clock. But we're the ones that have to deal with our young people, in the evening and on the weekend and on holidays, and try to keep our neighborhoods adaptable for what they do after the schools have closed their doors and others have gone home. That community groups is not merely just a national organization that has an affiliate or a charter in the community, and they live elsewhere, particularly like here in Washington. But real community groups, such as the councils on education that have been existing for 30 and 40 years, are finding it hard to be accepted as partners with the department, and in some cases with the media, that we have a part in the reforming of public education, because these are our children.
But when you use the word department, what do you mean there?
The Department of Education.
The U.S. Department of
Education,
or the
and how it defines an education stakeholder. They're merely the larger ones, rather than the small groups. I mean, I commend the secretary for holding his listening to it and going out and opening and change and attempt to change the mindset on community engagement and empowerment. But I think that there still needs to be some effort to bring in those small neighborhood organizations that deal with children voluntarily with no pay.
Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more, and I would hope that if you see places where particularly our Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnership Center at the Department of Education can be useful in interpreting that to the Department of Education, that I'll give you my card, and that you would share that, because I think what you're pointing to is an important issue, and we need to make sure that it isn't just words that are coming from the president or the secretary, but as there are various things that come out from the department, that it actually practices that's really where it is. And so so thank you for that. currently a very small office. Two of the people are here. Menachem Herman is sitting here, and Heather Foster is here. And then I'm in the office. Michael Robbins is in the office, and then our director is Reverend Brenda Girton Mitchell. So that's a way of saying that what we're able to do is with those resources. There are currently, the reason that Reverend Girton Mitchell and Michael Robbins are not here today is because right now they're in Memphis, Tennessee, where they're meeting with interfaith leaders in Memphis, and they're meeting with educators, and they're meeting with community groups, and they're meeting with representatives from the Corporation for National and Community Service. Specifically, and this is one of the things that we're working on, is developing models where the way that the Corporation for National and Community Service, which operates the AmeriCorps Vista program, can be used in order to place community organizers or connectors between schools and community groups. And they're working on helping that community kind of clarify and identify a model for how Memphis can do that, and so that there's a person who is an AmeriCorps Vista volunteer. The second thing that we are working on and do is developing resources for community groups to be able to become more engaged. And there are some of those on our website currently at www.ed.gov/edpartners. And we're in the process of working on increasing and developing those resources. We're also, another thing that our office is in the midst of and working on is that the President has a interagency task force on engaged fatherhood. And our staff is very much involved in that work of engaging fatherhood. Just last week, Michael Robbins was in Orlando working with folks there to promote that group, and the White House is developing a program that will include resources and programs for engaged fatherhood. And probably the most important part of our work is the support of and encouragement of just what we're talking about here, of individual communities, faith-based and secular, to facilitate their involvement in schools, to make sure that where we can be supportive, not just encouraging, but helping with providing resources to help make that a possibility. So.
Do we have any other questions? Let me ask one myself, Ken. In regards to reform, what has led some schools to need more reform than others? What are the main factors in the difficulties that have schools found themselves in?
One of the real benefits that we've gained from the No Child Left Behind legislation that came out of President Bush's legislative initiatives is that we have good actual testing data on what's happening in schools. Now, there's some real problems with that, and we'll talk about that, but it gave us an idea that, well, there are some schools where kids are learning and some schools where kids aren't learning. And it turns out that there are about 5% of the schools that we can identify where there are high levels of dropout and where students are not moving a grade level at a time. So you say, well, so now we know where they are. What is it that's the difference? The biggest thing that we know is leadership, and and so that's the one thing that you can see there. What Arnie Duncan has offered to those 5,000 schools is if they change their leadership, and there's 4 models, and I won't go into each one of them, but basically it says if they take seriously what they're going to do, develop a plan, that the federal government will give them up to $2 million a year for 3 years to implement the plan. Because another thing we learned from No Child Left Behind is that it isn't enough just to say, oh, this school isn't very good, and then it says, oh, in most cases, maybe even all cases, they knew it wasn't working. But this is saying, okay, now bring in the kind of leadership that's going to make a difference, and have a plan, and the federal government is going to provide some really serious money for you to implement that plan to be able to turn these schools around. And Arnie Duncan talks about building from the bottom up, of fixing those schools, and then you determine what are the next schools that are in trouble, and let's build those up until finally everything is built up.
Any questions? Or otherwise, I'll ask one final question. Yes, ma'am.
And I am hearing more and more talk about the year-round school coming during the summer as well. And I'm wondering if there are any ideas how that's going to play out. Is it going to be a continuation of the regular school year, or would it be a paradigm entirely different from the regular school year? Because growing up without summer school, I was deeply grateful I didn't have to go to school. And I was feeling sorry for my friends who had to take reading or math during the school. But I can imagine programs that could be very stimulating for kids that would be the equivalent of a field project for college students. But during the course of the summer, for 2 months, you're working on projects, whether you're in business or agriculture or downtown at a McDonald's or wherever you are actually working with your hands, and not just your brain.
Okay. Yeah. Good question. One of the things that Arnie Duncan has really pushed for and encouraged is grows out of the observation that in the United States, children spend less time in school than they do other places. I don't know, how's it compared to Australia? Is it in the United States and Australia, do Australians spend about the same amount of time as Americans do in school?
Basically, yes.
But many countries that have high academic results, Korea and Finland and so on, children are just spending more time in school. Recognizing that it'd be very difficult to just pay for teachers to work an extra 2 hours a day across the whole country. One of the proposals has been just that if faith-based and secular community organizations will take seriously providing additional time and educational support. There's your specific question about year-round schools. There's one study that indicates that when we see the difference in achievement between white students and African American students, and they just studied those two groups, that almost all of that loss can be accounted for by what's happening to the African American students during the summer, and that they're falling further behind than the white students are. And that the logical conclusion to that kind of a study is that if we can take more seriously making sure that we don't lose that summer setback, that we can maybe even do away with the majority of the achievement gap between minority students and recent immigrants and white students in our schools. Having said that, the decision about how the school calendar is either done by the state or by the local school district, and the federal government doesn't have a say in that. And so those decisions are being made, and there are lots of experiments that are going on in states and in local school districts that are deciding how they can make sure that they do the best job of educating and taking seriously the year-round or what it means to make sure that kids have what they need in order to succeed. Yeah, the Department of Education has a website that's called What Works, and I think if you go to ed.gov, www.ed.gov, and type in What Works, I think you'll get there. Do you happen to know the exact? I can't.
Doing what, if you're referring to doing what works?
Doing what works.
Right, so it actually starts out with
www.dww. Doing what works. Yeah. ed.gov. Yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't the Department of Education Race to the Top initiative serve as the hammer of the Department of Education to direct states and localities on what to do?
I would use the word incentive rather than hammer. but I think your point is well taken, is that one of the strategies that the Arne Duncan has developed is the race to the top, which states were asked, well, if we were going to fix our education system, what would we do to fix it? And there were some enticements in that, saying, well, we already know some things that don't work, and if you do reform already, you're more likely to have a good plan for how to go on from this point. And so then states were asked to offer plans of, if we had federal money to do what we needed to do to fix our education system.
Before we go, can you speak on the importance of what the department is doing to have states and localities deal with truancy in the schools as a factor in trying to close the achievement gap?
Yeah. To be honest, I don't know where there are federal programs. I'm very aware of the program that New York City has as kind of a model program where they observed that truancy, that the kids who came to school learned more than the kids that didn't. It's not, sort of, yeah, you don't have to be real smart to figure that one out. But in New York City, they have a very extensive truancy program that is identifying the kids that are at risk and placing them under a kind of special watch and with adults that are paying attention to those particular kids and looking for signs of potential truancy issues, and then doing the same thing of an almost mentoring, just sort of making sure that those kids, somebody cares about them, and that's been picked up. And that's one program that I'm aware of that's just really taking seriously across New York City, that both truancy is an issue, but then the way to deal with it is one child at a time.
If I may, one final question before we wrap up, and we appreciate, of course, the engagement with our audience. and you mentioned some international countries, but are there role models in terms of other countries? Who are they, and why are they important in terms of both current education levels and models, and in terms of their own reformation, and are there models in terms of reformation that America may look towards? So who, what, and why?
Sure. This is something that gets discussed at the department quite a bit and comes up. What's happening in other places. I'd like to answer that in two ways.
Thank you.
One is to take the example of Finland. And one of the things that we know about Finland is that teachers have an incredibly honored place in the society. In fact, I saw one study about Finland that just sort of illustrates this, where they asked the Finnish women, what occupation would you like your husband to have? And teacher was at the top. And so it's that sort of an environment in Finland. Korea is another example as being very successful in educating their young people. And Arnie Duncan loves to tell a story where he was in Korea and sitting down with his counterpart, and they were talking, and he said to his Korean counterpart, well, what is the most difficult issue that you face? And the Korean equivalent of the Secretary of Education said, well, my biggest problem is the high expectation that parents have. Both of those kind of illustrate what internationally, I think what will have the best schools in the world when we have teachers that are honored and are really seen as important in leading our nation, and when parents are demanding and expecting a high quality education for their children.
So somewhat of a cultural reformation.
A cultural reformation.
And on that note, we thank you, and we thank Ken for coming today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.